Hi everyone, I thought we'd have a look through my knitting bag today. This is my kit that I take me if ever I go out knitting. Sometimes I'll have a better idea of what I'm likely to need, and I won't mind if I'm missing something. I'll just pack my knitting away and leave it till I get home. But this is generally what I take, especially if I'm with a group of people and I'm knitting with them at the local knitting club or something, because actually I can share what I've taken and they'll be quite happy to use my scissors or my tape measure or something. So the simplest things I have are my measuring tape and my scissors, and in here I have my needles. I have four different sizes of tapestry needle for, well, depending on what type of wool I'm using. I do find it useful. Sometimes I don't want such a large hole if I'm using a smaller, thinner thread to knit with. And here I have what I use as stitch markers. I use a piece of yarn from a previous project and I just tie a knot in the top. So I find them easier to use. So that's what I have. So that's my needles, my scissors and my measuring tape. Most people will have them as they go knitting. I also have my crochet hooks. Generally, I'm only keeping them in here because I just want to keep them safe and I'm not really sure where else to keep them. But I wouldn't take this whole pack with me if I'm going out. What I do have in the bottom here is just one size of crochet hook, and that's what I'm using at the moment. That's the yarn I'm knitting with at the moment. I need that size of knitting needle, so I've got out this size of crochet hook. That is obviously useful if you drop a stitch. Check out my other video for how to pick up a drop stitch and you'll see me using this crochet hook. So I would say that is another essential. Not many people have them in their knitting bags, but I find that essential. I have a couple of cable needles. I actually have more cable needles here, which came free with a magazine. It's quite nice to use a coloured one sometimes. I also have longer pieces of thread, which I do need occasionally, especially if I'm knitting gloves and I need to hold the thumb for a while. I would put it on a piece of thread rather than a traditional stitch holder. I would use a stitch holder for a larger project, but for gloves, just holding the stitches for a thumb, for example, I would use one of these pieces of thread rather than having to use the current yarn that I'm knitting with. And here I have a stash of all sorts of bits and pieces. I have stitch holders in here. You can see these are traditional stitch markers, which you put in your needle if you want to mark where you're knitting and a particular thing in the pattern happens. So you would use that, or as I do, a piece of yarn with a knot in it. And on the other side here I have needle gauges. That's an old family one, so I've kept it. And crucially, because these are all, the two I have here are actually very old-fashioned, they have the old UK needle size on them. I have a gauge here, a little chart which tells me the millimetres, the US size and the old UK size. So I'm all set to go. If I'm a bit confused about which needle I have, I can use this and transfer it to the pattern, wherever the pattern may come from. And that's the thing these days. If you buy a pattern online, or if you buy a pattern in a book, for example, I'm not always sure whether the book or the pattern is going to tell me the needle size in millimetres, old UK or US size. So I do find that gauge helpful if I'm going through a variety of patterns. What I also have here is a pencil and a little pack of sticky notes that will keep track of where I am in the pattern. I just do tallies as I'm going along if I have to count stitches in rows. So you can possibly see there, that's how I count my stitches, my needles. I do find it a lot easier than just going through the pattern and ticking. If I have to go back to the pattern another time, I'm ticking or crossing out the same thing again, and then I just confuse myself. And two things in here. It's another stitch holder, and sometimes if I'm out, my friends want to borrow this. This you can stick on the end of a knitting needle if you're lucky and it fits. There you go. And count the stitches with that. It's a stitch counter. So you can just wind the stitches round as you go. So that's another option, as well as using pencil and paper. I tend to use pencil and paper, or I count in my head, but I know quite a few people who use stitch counters, and they borrow that from me, or well, I've had it a long time. I suppose I'm just sentimental, but that's always in my knitting bag too. There you go. So that's pretty much a basic kit. Obviously I don't carry all my knitting needles with me everywhere I go because I'm not going to use all of them. I carry knitting needles basically in the home. I store them at home, I just get out the ones I need. This is what I take with me when I'm knitting out and about. I'm taking my knitting on holiday with me or something. What do you have in your knitting bag? Let me know if there's anything that I might have missed, or anything that you use that's specific to your knitting projects. Thanks for joining me. Bye!